Sujatha's work is characterized by an equal dedication to victims and persons accused of crime. She speaks publicly and inside prisons about surviving child sexual abuse and her path to healing and forgiveness. A former victim advocate and public defender, Sujatha was awarded a Restorative Justice Fellowship in 2008, which she used to begin a successful restorative juvenile diversion program in Alameda County, California. Today, she's the director of the Restorative Justice Project in Oakland, California. Sujatha's thrilled to be back in Burlington, Vermont, where she served as a federal law clerk for the Honorable William K. Sessions III in 1999. Please join me in welcoming Sujatha Baliga.
Good morning, everyone. So we've heard a lot, right? And I just want to start by appreciating people's capacity and willingness to remain in the room early in the morning, to get up so early, and to hear so many people speak. So we are running behind, and I'm going to do my best to also still slow down and to breathe and be present with all of you. And so I would encourage everyone else to do the same thing, and just to let you all know that I honor people getting up, stretching, moving. It is a lot of this, and so I just want to appreciate your doing whatever it is that you need to do to stay present in the room. I want to also start by acknowledging those who belong to this land and who are here before us and are still here today, the Abenaki people. And say it is wonderful to be back in Vermont. So I did begin my legal career here in earnest, clerking for Judge Sessions, who really is a moral and intellectual giant and really believed in me in my late 20s when I was here out of law school, and has always encouraged me in my work, even when I stopped the practice of law. I also got married here in Vermont, in Kingsland Bay State Park. And a couple of years ago, Karen Tronsgard-Scott, the executive director of Vermont Network Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, who's here, brought me here and connected me to beautiful people from my past, and it's just really grateful. I'm really grateful to be back here again. So I'll tell you a little bit about what we do at Impact Justice in Oakland, California. We are, that's where we're headquartered, we're a national organization, and we work it's a innovation and research center, and we work to both reduce three things, actually. Reduce the number of folks going into the criminal legal system, improve conditions of confinement. So, for example, one of the things we do is we run the Prison Rape Elimination Act Resource Center in that sort of bucket of our work. And then the third is creating a better on-ramp for folks returning home after periods of incarceration. And there I run the Restorative Justice Project, which sits sort of in that first piece, reducing the amount of folks going into the criminal legal system. And the work we do there, and by we, I really mean we, I have an amazing team at Impact Justice, is in two primary buckets. One is what we call Restorative Justice Diversion, and that work is led by Ashley George. And that work really is about face-to-face dialogue, participatory decision-making, in which families and communities come together to support those who've done harm to be directly accountable to their crime victims' self-identified needs. And this work started with a Restorative Justice Fellowship I had in 2008 with a pilot that we started then when I was working with Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth, back when John Kidda was still in Oakland with us there. And through that, that continues to this day, and we've got some wonderful recidivism and other data that we've been studying. 44% reduction in recidivism, 91% satisfaction rate for participating survivors of crime. And these are kids of color committing pretty serious crimes, or what other people would consider serious crimes. I'm a former, also death penalty lawyer, so I have a different categorization of what serious crimes are. Burglaries, robberies, car theft, teen dating, violence, even sexual assault. Cases are diverted pre-charge and sometimes pre-booking to restorative justice. So other folks working on my team there on sort of rolling this out in 10 jurisdictions across the nation, and we do have way more than 10 cities who are interested in sort of trying to work with their communities to replicate something. I don't want to say we are replicating this. It's not like McDonald's franchise of restorative justice that we're doing, but rather deeply working with families, communities, formerly incarcerated young people, et cetera, to design programs that work for each of these jurisdictions, whether they're Nashville or Philadelphia, wherever it is that we're working with amazing district attorneys who want to see this roll out in their communities as well. And one of our people is actually a community organizer who's also a longtime restorative justice facilitator, to think about what is restorative justice organizing, or what Fania Davis coined the term restorganizing, look like, to really hold our systems partners accountable to what is the right way to do things. So we also have somebody on that team who does amazing work in our building out our training and technical assistance in a way that is truly responsive to the community flavors that we are having this incredible blessing of seeing all across the nation. Jenny Ports, who's actually a graduate of this university, so I just needed to bring her name into the room. There's many others. The other wing of the work we do is in sexual and intimate partner violence. And that work is led by Nuri Nusrat, who is actually here at this conference. She's coming a little late this morning, but she's here at this conference, and you should connect with her to learn more about that work. It's really taking off. Richmond, California, Contra Costa County, the Family Justice Center had been listening to us for the past 6-7 years. We're saying, we need to do this with intimate partner violence. And they went out and got a big grant, and they called us, and they're like, we're doing this. And so the Family Justice Center is working beautifully with a group of other organizations, the Rainbow Center, Rise Center for Youth, all these other community and a bunch of organizations working in culturally specific ways around intimate partner violence. Narika, one of my first jobs out of college, a South Asian domestic violence organization in the Bay Area, all coming together to think about co-facilitating cases of ongoing intimate partner violence. And it's been an amazing beginning to that work. We're doing some deep thinking about some of the questions that Leah's raised and others as they apply to our work there. So at Impact Justice, we're uncompromising on a few things. One is that we are about circumventing criminalization. So we do work solely in the pre-charge and pre-booking contexts in these things. And that is not to say that there's not other wonderful work happening in restorative justice across engagement with the criminal legal system, but our work is really squarely placed there for a number of reasons. Because we see, in our communities that mass criminalization has neither served survivors nor communities, has not kept us more safe, nor helped folks turn their lives around in any meaningful way. And so that is really sort of a bedrock core principle of our work. We start our work with thinking deeply about reducing racial and ethnic disparities. I'll be talking a little bit about that for all the reasons that Adam has talked about earlier. Victim-oriented, right? So what does it mean to not just have circles, I should be careful about it because there's real value to this, having circles inside prisons where people are thinking about the impact of their behavior, but really to center on victim self-identified needs to produce justice outcomes, right? And to not fall into that trap of everything can go to surrogacies or to panels or to other types of modalities. And community-led is another thing that is really critical to our work, right? Creating spaces for families and communities to heal their own harms, to have facilitators be reflective of the communities that they're working with, and really stepping away from this notion that this is us fixing them, and really getting out of the way so people can do what they have always been internally resourced to do. And the final piece that we are really, really adamant about is what we call, for those lawyers in the room, we call this a reverse Miranda. It's a memorandum of understanding that we get signed from the district attorneys in the jurisdictions we're working in that says that nothing that you say in restorative processes can be used against you in a court of law. And DAs actually sign this, and it really creates a space in which folks can tell us the whole truth about what has happened, including, and particularly in the mutual assault cases where stuff is messy. And when we're doing a circle around that kind of stuff, right, what does it mean to really create a space in which we can create a potential for this unconditional healing and love by everybody being able to tell us what actually happened. And finally, the thing that we're working on, I think that's most important in the restorative, in this work is what we're calling the Toolkit right now. We're going to call it something else, but I'm thinking in maybe somewhat pessimistic ways and calling it our cave paintings. I really love this. I heard this recently. Jayesh Bhai is a man who runs an ashram in Ahmedabad in India. It's a Gandhian ashram, and he talks about the urgency of now, or to say now or tomorrow, the urgency of now with the patience of 1,000 years. And I really think that when we're talking about the problems that we're dealing with today, we need to be holding both of these things at the same time. And why is it that we're writing down, like, how is it that we did this, and what are we learning from what we do? In part because in one of our jurisdictions where we were really successful, I met with the DA, and I was so excited about our recidivism data and our comparative analysis with, kids who were getting criminalized for the same crimes, and he literally said to me, I know what you do is better than what we do, but if I send you any more cases, I won't be able to justify my staffing. And so I said, oh my goodness, we might lose this in this jurisdiction, or we might lose this in this place. And so what does it mean to do this in a way that is thinking not just about now, but in the ways in which, from so many Indigenous teachers that I've learned from, that we really need to be thinking about generations upon generations upon generations from now in our thought process and how we do this, and watering seeds really now for many, many, many moons down the road, where our ancestors planted those seeds about how we can move forward in a good way. It is because folks who decided that the Minnesota Department of Corrections family group conferencing trainings really are the basis, and that somebody thought to put those online in Word docs that we could take, and the PowerPoints, all were there, like 10 years ago, those were there, they're not anymore, and that we could take those and say, oh, okay, we learned some things about race, since y'all made that, right? And with no disrespect, but really, thank you. Thank you for those bones that you gave us that we can build from. Thank you for those incredible seeds that we've learned to nurture in different ways. So the title of this talk is, I forget, Physician, Heal Thyself, Lived Experience in Restorative Justice. Really, when I think about this, I think about when I'm sitting in circle and people ask the question, up front, who are you and why are you here? Who are you and why are you here? And I think a lot of what's beautiful about circle process is that we model that by answering the question, too, as keepers, right? And so I'll start with me. I'm the child of Mohandas Baliga, whose first name intimates that he was born the day Gandhiji was released from prison. I'm also the daughter of Sarala, who had no desire to be in this country, but did her very best with very little to raise two brown-skinned girls in rural Pennsylvania in the 1970s and 80s. I'm also a survivor of child sexual abuse, incest by my father, for a decade until he died when I was 16 years old. And I was also sexually assaulted in college and went through a very painful and ineffective process of dealing with that at the college level. And then I was raped the year after I graduated from college, 2 weeks before I took my LSAT, by someone who was tutoring me in my LSATs. And I have been subjected to an amazing amount of sexual harassment in many aspects of my life, including workplaces. And so I am someone also who was completely deserved by the systems that were designed in theory to protect me, right? Even as a child, I knew not to tell what was happening in my home because I didn't want my father locked up. I didn't want potential immigration consequences for my mother or for the mental health issues that she was struggling with at that time to in any way impact her capacity to continue to have me as her child. I didn't want to be taken away from my sister. I didn't want to be put in the home, Child Protective Services, where I later learned what we had all suspected was that pastor was sexually abusing the kids that were in that home, right? I didn't want any of that. What I wanted, if someone had asked me, was for my family to heal. I wanted my family to heal. So I'm a former victim advocate, a public defender. I've seen on many sides of things how there are shortcomings on all sides of the systems in which we've been coming from a place of good heart, many of us, right, who engage in these systems and processes. But I ultimately left the practice of law to be a part of the restorative justice revolution that I believe happened in Oakland and is still revolving and happening and growing and spinning out in beautiful ways. So I do want you all at some point during your time here to think about who are you and why were you drawn to restorative justice? Who are you and why are you here? And please do not answer that you wanted to help somebody else. I want to know something about you. We can't be asking folks in circle to do anything that we're not capable of doing ourselves, right? When we are asking folks to answer these questions, otherwise it's just voyeurism. It's like restorative justice as voyeurism. It's, now that we're measuring these outcomes with recidivism, et cetera, and I am a fan of doing that to some degree, but now we're like putting our voyeurism in a petri dish, right? So that's like literally the opposite of restorative justice. So I'm working on a book, and it's really, really hard to write because the details of what I have lived through and what I have learned and the mistakes that I've made in my own life and my work are really hard to write about. But it's the details that make writing really, really good. But I am also, it's really, really hard because I'm tired of the details of what happened to my brown body in rural Pennsylvania, making other people feel things. Like, I want to know what you're feeling. I want to feel with you, right? That is what compassion actually means, to feel with others. And I really want to walk on a parallel journey with you as an empowered person, right? I want us to be walking on our parallel journeys. I love this quote by an Aboriginal woman from Australia, Lilla Watson. She said, "If you come here to help me, you're wasting my time. But if you've come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let's walk together. Let's work together, right?" That is what I want to do with the folks in this room and the folks in this movement. So this conference, as has been named by Adam, this conference and our organizations and our programs are insufficiently diverse. And in part, yes, it is because many of us are literally behind bars or locked in places where they cannot join us. But I actually want us to be a little bit accountable in this room a little bit more specifically, right? So the spirit with which I bring this is with complete and total love. I have said to many of the folks I've already gotten to give loving hugs to in this room, like, to be clear, many of my very, very, very favorite white people are in this room. Really, you are. Yeah, like so many of you. And I'm literally overjoyed to be here. But, my favorite white folks, my favorite not formally incarcerated folks, like, you're here, and that is beautiful. At the same time, that's clearly not enough, right? So, and this is not even about calling in or calling out or all of the stuff that we do, right? This is actually about calling you to yourselves, calling me to myself, right? So how does this happen? How does it happen that this conference is insufficiently diverse, right? And if you're people of color in the room, right? What is the last thing that we organized that we said was super diverse, that was ethnically diverse, right? But where were the indigenous folks? Where were the deaf folks? Where were the queer folks? Did that actually happen as well? And I don't say this to shame any of us, but to ask what thinking went into place. So this is something I learned so much from Justice Yazzie, who we have such an incredible honor of having here with us. The thinking is really important. This thinking, even before we go into planning, right? We have to think deeply about these things. In the development of the theme, of who the speakers are, of the financial and other accessibility issues here, was diversity a priority from the beginning? So many of these topics that we're talking about are about intersecting with systems, and every single one of these systems is drowning in racial bias and disparate impact and structural oppression. Every one of them, every system that we are talking about. So by show of hands, how many folks were at the NACRJ conference in Oakland? Right, a good number of you, right? So we spent a lot of time thinking. Right? In the same way that if you spend a lot of time in the tier 1 of restorative justice land before you get to tier 2 and 3, like that relationship building, that thinking, that deep thinking about how is it that we're going to pull off such an unbelievably diverse and celebratory event, right? I would strongly suggest talking to Tiasha and Fania and others and Ashley George from my staff who are deeply involved in the creation of that process. It's intentional. So like our methods of making sure that this new wave of RJ is more effective at reducing racial and ethnic disparities than Barge was, we need to have a racial and ethnic disparities lens if we're going to be doing anything about it. It has to be like actually the place we start. So for example, in Oakland, at the Restorative Justice Project, when we're working with a new jurisdiction, actually the first thing we do is we say, can we get your probation data? Can we get your probation data about what does your juvenile detention facility look like? Who's in there? It's all kids of color. Who's in there and from where and for what crimes? Let's start a pilot project with those kids for those crimes in that zip code. It's actually pretty simple. It's like, but you have to start with that question. I mean, you could start your pilot anywhere. It could be the really well-intentioned person who has the energy, but that's often not the mama with the child who is dead on a cold case, and a kid who's actually locked up at the same time, who knows everybody and everything that you would need to make that program phenomenal, right? So that's something that I really want us to be thinking about. I also just think that restorative justice needs to be led by folks with lived experience. And I want to talk a little bit about intimate partner violence and sexual harm. So 50% of folks don't contact us, everything Lee said on the data, right? 50% of folks don't contact the system at all, and 20% of those who do in domestic violence say it made them less safe. Like, this is an abject failure, right? And these are pandemics, right? So with child sexual abuse, the crime I suffered, 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys, that's what we know. 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys in this country. And less than 3% of cases are effectively prosecuted to some degree that result in conviction. So that's like a truly abysmal failure. So how did we end up with these failures? I think what we need to be thinking about, who are the actual experts, right? What if we had asked survivors in developing these processes themselves, what happened? It's the RJ questions. What did you need? Whose obligation was it to meet those needs? What would that look like in action, in practice? And what if we asked the folks using violence, what happened to you that you did that to her, that you did that to him? What did you need to come out of this violence? What do you need to stay violence-free? What can you do to make this right? So I think we've had enough of the Megan's Law and the Marcy's Law. I want to have a Sujatha's Law. Ask the resilient survivors what worked for you that you turned out so great, if I must say so myself. So that... Thanks. So that we can create the causes and conditions for that to happen for others, right? And it's a very individualized process. So ask those of lived experience. And I start with survivor circles before we even get to starting to design something, not just in the process that we do, but actually in the design of the processes themselves. Sit with those who've done harm in circle. My friend Sonia Shah does amazing work inside prisons, and I get the opportunity through her work to sit with people who have raped children. And when I do, one guy I ended up, when we had lunch in the middle of this day-long circle where he was breaking down point by point how it was that he groomed children. And I was breaking down next to him, we're creating a little chart together of how it was that I was susceptible to grooming. And then we were creating another column about what did parents need to see from this dynamic? And then another column about what is it that we need to know between the two of us about what a restorative justice healing process can be. It's not just looking to the people of Hollow Water. It's actually looking to us. Every time I'm I want to come to New Zealand, and the people in New Zealand say, just do it in Oakland, right? I finally did get to go to New Zealand. It was amazing. What I learned was that there's some things that they were missing there, right? It's great that they've got 89 children right now in juvenile detention facilities because of their restorative justice family group conferencing revolution from the late 80s. But they still have radical racial and ethnic disparities. So there's some thinking that we're doing here that can be of benefit to them, right? So we really have to ask those questions. So I am first and foremost a Buddhist, and as my work is really, my personal work is to be a lamp on the path, but so mixing religious metaphors here, we really do have to take the log out of our own eyes before we start taking the splinter out of anyone else's, right? So I think it's really important that we stop telling other people's stories. There are times when I do, from time to time, with the permission and blessing and actually the request of some of these folks who were like, get the story out there, right? But it is really important that we tell our own stories. Otherwise, it's what a friend of mine calls trauma porn, right? And I actually get overwhelmed at conferences like this, listening to folks talking about, and then this horrible thing happened, and then this horrible thing happened, and this horrible thing happened, and then we get into like reconciliation porn, and I just feel it feels too voyeuristic. Like I want to know more about what is transforming for you and your organizations and your work and your thinking. And again, why are we doing this work? If it's because we feel guilty about our relative race privilege, and I have quite a bit of relative race privilege in this country, doesn't mean I haven't experienced and don't continue to experience discrimination on the basis of race. But if I'm coming out of a place of guilt, then my work is charity. And that is not what we're doing with restorative justice, right? Our work needs to be to take out the roots, starting with our own people, right? So have circles with your own family about with the folks who voted for Trump. For reals, like that is a thing you could do, right? If you're with a Catholic organization, this opportunity to work with this big Catholic organization that wanted to like go fix the brown kids in the neighborhood across town, right? And I was like, hey, how about we talk about CSA in the Catholic Church, right? Let's talk about child sexual abuse, right? And when you have done that, then you can walk on gorgeous parallel journeys with others who are under-resourced, but you've got to do it yourselves. I have to do it myself, right? That is my daily religious practice. Because really, restorative justice is about families and communities healing ourselves. And if you don't think that there's anything that your people need to heal about yourselves and my people need to heal about myself, like I'm a person with amazing amounts of caste privilege in my own cultural community, I haven't been looking deep enough. I have not been looking deep enough, and I'm not kicking it with the right people. So we need to really walk our talk. A good place to start is with truth and reconciliation. We desperately need it in this country for genocide, for colonialism's aftermath, for slavery. And while not perfect, we can follow in other countries' footsteps, one even including our neighbor. One state here, I'm so sorry I missed the film last night. Apparently we've gotten started, but we need to go deeper and we need to do more. And even within our movement work, right? So I was literally, because I was saying many of the things that Leah was talking about this morning, I was literally run out of the domestic violence movement in my 20s. And I know many women of color had the same experience. In 1994, I was working for NYPD, thinking through what does institutionalizing mandatory arrest policy look like. And I said, even when I say this today, my face gets hot and I'm embarrassed. And then we got our first set of data back. I was like all about race. I've always been all about race, right? I was like, let's disaggregate this and understand whether or not we are properly serving women of color. And what did the data tell me? That the biggest rise in arrests was of Black women. And I was like, oh, wait, maybe we're messing this up. Maybe this is not what we're supposed to be doing, right? And then I paused and I looked at myself. And I said, I actually never accessed the system. I didn't want my father locked up. I didn't want potential immigration consequences for him. So why was I now deciding that I knew better for other people, right? But that wisdom, though, was pathologized in order for me to have a job in like the domestic violence world at that time, right? Because I was literally told that my own growing forgiveness towards my father at that time was Stockholm Syndrome. And I was told by the therapist that somebody in the movement hooked me up with that my impediments in my work were caused by a failure to individuate based on my over-identification with my Indian culture. So, it's interesting today to think about those things and how when I finally found my path and my way, that the very notions of interdependence, right, that exist religiously for me and exist within restorative justice when it's operating at its best, were things that I knew as a child, And now I'm getting invited back to talk about the very things in the same state coalitions that weren't wanting to hear that. And so this is literally amazing to see this kind of turnaround in one lifetime. Like you don't usually get to see the fruits of the thinking that you were involved in when people were dismissing it, right? But I just want to reiterate at this point now that the survivors and the folks who've done harm need to be not just involved in our processes, but in the creation of those processes. I don't say this to be bitter, I say it as an example. I don't want anti-violence movements to keep losing the wisdom of those who know better than anyone else what needs to happen to heal and end the violence. If we rooted out violence and exclusion and gatekeeping in our anti-violence movements, in the restorative justice movement, I need to name it, it is happening, we could actually move forward towards ending violence, towards restorative justice being a part of every single thing that we do, because really the journey is the destination. So what does our process look like in being inclusive in this way? So I just want to close with a note of unconditional love. I intend for you to receive this talk as an expression of my deep love, right? I am all about unconditional love. In the circle, when you tell me about the very horrific details of how you took someone's life, I lean in, right? And when you tell me about what your uncle did in your bedroom to you, I lean in, right? It's a blessing when you show me all the things that you are. I, like Adam, carried possibly a federally indictable amount of marijuana on my body when I was at Harvard, right? Which, was helping me get through because we had no money in my family, right? My father died when I was 16, and my mother had no capacity to help. And there was no way for me to make it through Harvard, right? With what I was doing to self-medicate my way through the complex post-traumatic stress disorder I was living it with. Not just from the sexual abuse, right, but from the unbelievable race-based bullying that I grew up with in rural Pennsylvania in the early 70s. So, and I want you to love me. When I talk in front of domestic violence organizations, I make a point of saying, and I hit one of my boyfriends with a closed fist, right, when he showed me zero physical violence. I need us to make space for all the stories, right? And I need us to make space not from a place of voyeurism, but from a place of open-heartedness, right? So it really is a blessing when you can show me all the things that you are, and I can show you all the things that I am, because if we don't do that, we're not going to come up with solutions. So I just would want to close with a quote from Dr. King also, which is, "I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality." I think we need to keep coming back to that over and over and over again. And what does it mean for us to be what we ought to be? Thank you all very much.